Hi, my proposal is very simple. I believe that mens rea should be construed to encompass not just ignorance of fact, but ignorance of wrongdoing. And I realize that the code, as it's typically or universally interpreted, is at odds with my proposal. So it's novel, and yet I think it would be a good innovation. I am somewhat tentative about it. Nonetheless, I think it would be desirable. So, as most of you know, if in fact someone makes a mistake of fact, depending on the content of the statute of which he's accused, he will likely have a defense. Whereas mistake about law doesn't function that way. So imagine the statute makes it a crime to knowingly hunt out of season. Well, someone who makes a mistake about the date and knows the hunting season ends or begins on September 1st, but thinks that he's within that range and makes a mistake about the date is not liable. He hasn't committed the offense of knowingly hunting out of season. He lacks mens rea. But someone who makes a mistake about the hunting season and thinks the hunting season extends to some time other than when it in fact does is making a mistake of law and is liable. And so that is a result that seems to me to be peculiar and unacceptable. I think mens rea should be construed to encompass both mistakes of law, mistakes about wrongdoing, as well as mistakes of fact. And that would be a welcome innovation in my judgment. Now, let me say a couple things about that. One is, of course, that most of the discussion about whether that's a good idea is likely to depend on normative controversy about whether it produces just results. I'm inclined to think it does. I'm prepared to argue for that, but that's not what my paper is about. That is a big topic, and we can talk about that if, in fact, people wish. But I'm assuming that many of us believe that someone who makes a mistake about wrongdoing is less culpable, less blameworthy than someone who knows perfectly well that what he's doing is in violation of law and proceeds anyway. And so I'm taking that normative judgment for granted, which is a huge assumption. I recognize that, but that's what I'm doing for purposes of this paper. I want to point out the advantages of construing mens rea in the way I do, and the particular context in which I argue that this would produce good results is in the context of the most recent Supreme Court decision on insanity, Collar versus Kansas, which, as many of you know, is a case from the state of Kansas where the insanity defense was abolished as a separate standalone defense. And so the only way a defendant who was clearly crazy could avoid criminal liability is by showing that he was so crazy he lacked mens rea. He did not know what he was doing, for example. And that seems to me to be exceedingly rare and very uncharitable. So Collar was, I think, pretty clearly crazy, but he had mens rea as it's interpreted today. But under my interpretation, he didn't know what he was doing was wrong. And so if my viewpoint were accepted, then that defendant would lack mens rea and would not be liable. So that seemed to me to be a welcome result. It would produce a result that almost every commentator thinks is desirable. We don't want to punish and hold criminally liable people like that who are clearly crazy. And even in jurisdictions that lack the insanity defense as a separate standalone defense, like Kansas and a handful of other jurisdictions, the defendant in Collar himself would be acquitted or found not guilty by reason of insanity, and then he would be dealt with the way NGRIs are dealt with. And so that, I think, would be a welcome result. Of course, I'm worried about how burdens of proof would be allocated if my proposal were accepted. I have reservations about it. It does seem difficult to suppose that the prosecution could prove beyond a reasonable doubt yet that defendants were aware that what they were doing is wrong. That's a consequence I'm prepared to live with, but I do admit that it gives me some pause. Perhaps it can be fixed. At any rate, I put my proposal to you for your consideration. Thank you.